Hello church, this is part 2 in this video series we're doing on a brief history of Christianity. If you watched the first video, we left off with the early church and getting into the medieval age, and that's what we're going to be looking at in this video. What was going on in the medieval church? What we're looking at here is about 1100 years. We stopped with Augustine in 387 AD. That's where we left off the last video. And this video is going to go from that point up until the Reformation, or about 1456 AD. So a really long stretch here. And there's a few reasons for that we'll get to. A couple questions that we might be asking as we're moving into this era. Some questions we can have as the medieval church era comes onto the scene is, how has theology developed during this time? One thing we saw in the ancient church, the early church video, was how heresy was combated and spoke against, and the role of the early church fathers in sort of putting up the bounds of orthodoxy and remaining true to biblical teaching. How is that going to continue over 1,000 years, this huge stretch that we're going to see in the medieval church? Why is it called the Dark Ages? You'll see when we look at this timeline that there's about 1,000 years where nothing happens. Why is that? And why do we not know what's going on? Why is there's so much going on in those first 300 years that we saw in the last video? Why is nothing going on for so long here in the Middle Ages? And then finally, how will the church continue to grow and expand? A subheading of that might be, how does persecution and martyrdom continue in this era? That continues. But how does the church move along and grow despite the challenges that it faces in this era? I just mentioned there, the key player here in the medieval church is Augustine. He was converted in 387 AD, arguably the most influential thinker in the history of Christianity after Jesus Christ himself and the Apostle Paul. His writings, in particular his writings Confessions and The City of God, really they become the bedrock of the church in the Middle Ages during this time. You can read those today. In fact, I think oftentimes in college courses you'll read portions of the Confession or the City of God because they are so influential, and they're still able to be read by us today. You could read Augustine's Confessions and be helped. Your spiritual life would be helped by you reading him today. That's how great of a thinker he was, and I think how true of a disciple he was, that he spoke and was getting at the truth that he saw in Scripture. And if it was true for Augustine then it's true for us today, right? That only makes sense. Some of the things that he emphasized really laid the foundation for the Protestant Reformation that would come over 1,000 years after him. In particular, a couple themes that he was really focused on, and he did a lot of work in developing that was basically untouched in the early church, were those issues of original sin. That is, what does it mean that we are lost in Adam? We know that the Bible speaks a lot about that, Romans in particular. But what does it mean for us to inherit that guilt that comes from our original sin? He wrote a lot about what grace is, what it means that we are forgiven by an act of grace in Jesus Christ. And then he wrote a lot about union with Christ. What does it mean for believers to be tied to Christ through his life, death, burial, and resurrection, even right now? Now, as I read those three themes, those are important themes for us to understand as Christians today, right? And if you were describing to someone, what doctrines are important to Christians, you might point to those. I mean, as what it means to understand what the Bible teaches. And that's what Augustine spent much of his time writing about and arguing and developing, were those three themes. One of his famous quotes is, "Give what you command and command what you will." Basically what he's saying there is he's talking about loving the law that comes from God. And he's basically saying that whatever God says, that's what we have to do. That we don't make up ways to follow Christ, we don't get to do whatever we want, but because God is good and he loves us, we're to love what he says and follow what he says. Again, that might not be groundbreaking for you as a Christian today, but in his time it was. And in fact, those are the seeds that would cause Martin Luther and others to do what they did in the Protestant Reformation 1,000 years later. One commentator said, he laid the groundwork for the foundation and acceptance of the doctrine of original sin, launched a nuanced discussion of the role of grace in the morality and soteriology, and set the trajectory for Christian ethics and ecclesiology, or how we understand the church. Monumental role that Augustine played. And really, everyone that came after Augustine is shaped in some way by the work that he did, that important role that he played. That's 387. Now watch this move. Jumping down 700 years. There's a few reasons for that. This is what we call the Dark Ages. I think the biggest issue is probably how heretics and heresies were dealt with. And that is they were burnt. And everything that they wrote was burnt. And so there's not much for us to really see and learn from that time. There's some, and I encourage you to go back and explore and dig there. But for the most part, everyone's still dealing with Augustine for all these times and arguing back and forth about what he said and what he meant and are you truly Augustinian or not, that sort of thing. We don't have a lot of counter proposals or heresies from this time because they were just destroyed and so and forgotten, and that's why it's partly why it's known as the Dark Ages. The next theme there, though, is in 1054. This is the East-West Schism. This is the split between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. This is partly due to theological issues. It's partly due to political issues. And this sort of split had been brewing for really centuries now before it happened. And again, it has to do with Augustine in many ways. So, for instance, the Eastern Orthodox Church didn't accept the doctrine of original sin. And not accepting that doctrine leads you to all sorts of different viewpoints. And so it became apparent that theologically the Catholic Church and what was happening in the Eastern Orthodox Church couldn't go together. That leads to disagreements about grace and salvation, justification, the Eucharist, Lord's Supper. And so they had this big split. It's interesting because, we talked so much in the last video about the unity of the church and believers sticking together, but perhaps it would happen no matter what, that as the church grew and expanded and it's following all of this huge geographical location, that splits would occur as people are standing up for what they believe to be truth. This schism actually has continued today, right? We know of the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodoxy is still around today, and they have still tried to work out their differing views in various councils, and even in the 20th century, they're trying to work out exactly what happened in that schism. So really an important break there, and would really set the stage for other schisms to happen, denominations to form, that sort of thing, as the ball that is the church gets rolling and as it grows and expands. A couple other people to talk through here in this section. Anselm there in 1093, he was the Archbishop of Canterbury. His most famous book writing is called Why Did God Become Man? And what he's exploring there is the atonement, what it is that Christ accomplished on the cross. One commentator said he was recognized in modern times as the originator of the ontological argument for the existence of God. And then the ontological argument is based on the idea of an absolutely perfect being, the fact of the idea being in itself a demonstration of existence. Little technical, little philosophical there. But what we're getting at here, especially in these next couple hundred years, is the philosophical argument for God and trying to prove God's existence through intellectual argument. That's what Anselm will do, that's what Aquinas will do, and what many others will do. But that book, Why Did God Become Man? Again, as theology is developing, understanding what happened on the atonement. Again, in the light of Augustine, right? Original sin, grace, here's Jesus Christ and the atonement. That's how this is sort of developing as we learn what it is that the Bible is teaching. These next two here, Waldo and Francis, you'll remember from the last video, we talked about the beginnings of the monastic movement. and people trying to figure out what it looked like to follow Christ, where these are two examples 1,000 years later of people continuing to do that. Peter Waldo founds the Waldensians, which is a reform movement emphasizing poverty, preaching, and the Bible. He and his followers were eventually condemned as heretics, and the Waldensians suffered great persecution for centuries. A lot of people that you will read or have been influenced by stem from this movement of trying to figure out what it means to follow Christ, in particular with the way we live, with our possessions and our money. It's a huge part of our lives. You see Francis of Assisi there. In 1206, he renounces wealth and goes on to lead a band of poor friars preaching about the simple life. What they're doing is they're trying honestly to figure out, what does it mean to follow Christ? How does my life need to be differentiated from the average person who doesn't follow Christ? Again, their answers may not always be the best answers, but I think they're asking good questions, right? Questions that we ought to be asking today. What does it mean to follow Christ? What does Jesus want me to do in my daily life? What does he want me to do with my money? How does he want me to handle my possessions? That's what these guys were trying to answer. Then we see there again Thomas Aquinas, who you've surely heard of. He wrote a bunch of different things. Probably his magnum opus was the Summa Theologica, 1273. And what he argues there, he's probably most known for his argument of the 5 ways. That is, he's trying to prove the existence of God sort of apart from the Bible in 5 philosophical ways. You may have heard about the unmoved mover or the first cause. That there must be a grand designer, that sort of thing. That's Aquinas. And again, what he's doing there is evangelistic, and scholarly, but he's trying to defend the existence of God. One of the ways that he's asking the question of how do I follow Christ is by that sort of intellectual assent to argue the basis for believing in God. And so, again, I remember being in college, I read multiple classes about Aquinas' 5 ways. You could Google those and read them, and you might take a few moments and think about his arguments to see if they hold water or not. Certainly critiques there as well of Aquinas. And that's something that I want to remind us of again. We talked about it in the last video, but all of these people that we talk about, men so far, in the history of Christianity, they're certainly heroes of the faith. They're certainly saints who have gone before us, but they weren't without their flaws, right? They were sinners themselves. That was part of Augustine's revelation, that he was a sinner who needed to be saved, just as we all are. And so I think it's important for us to appreciate them, see how they, the gifts that they gave us and their thought and their development and their study, but we shouldn't hold them up as flawless. And even sometimes the things that they believed were not fully correct because they hadn't been fully developed yet and wrestled with. That's part of the development of theology through this time, and that's certainly true with Aquinas. These last 3 that I want to talk about are probably the most interesting from this era, and these 3 are what I might call precursors to the Reformation. That is, the Protestant Reformation is just about to happen in the 1500s as churches, as the church will split, Catholic and Protestant. That didn't just come out of nowhere. Everything has been building up to this point, and these 3 in particular are sort of the events that lead up to that. First, we see there John Wycliffe, hugely important. Read a biography of him last year. Amazing disciple, amazing follower of Christ. He's kicked out of Oxford, but he then oversees the translation of the Bible into English for the first time. He's known as the morning star of the Reformation because it gets at this idea of how the Bible is translated and actually into the hands of people. Think about how important it is for you to have your own Bible in your language right now, rather than only being able to hear the Bible when you went to church on Sunday. That makes you incredibly reliant on the person preaching, and you wouldn't get the full diet that the Scripture, that the full counsel of God gives us in the Bible. And so the Bible being translated into English and into other languages for the first time, incredibly important for people to see where the true church, the Catholic Church, had gone wrong. coming in the Reformation. The next name there is perhaps one that you're less familiar with. That's John Huss in English. It's probably Jan Hus in his original language, something like that. He was a follower of Wycliffe. He was teaching Wycliffe's ideas, wanting to translate the Bible and getting it into the hands of his people. He was condemned at the stake and burned by the Council of Constance. He was called a heretic because he was believed to be teaching against the church, that is the Catholic Church, because of his views of reform. The reason he's so popular, perhaps the most interesting thing about him, there's a lot about him that you can go and read, and I encourage you to do that. But as he was being burned at the stake, he very famously said this quote, where he said, "Today you all bake a goose, but there comes a swan which you won't be able to cook." And what's interesting about that is 100 years after this is when Martin Luther comes onto the scene. And so in some ways, this is very prophetic by Huss, right? We can debate whether God actually gave him a prophecy and actually he saw Martin Luther coming onto the scene, or if he just saw the way that the dominoes were falling, right? He saw the seeds of Reformation that had been sown and knew that even though he wasn't able to accomplish this reform fully, that there would come after him someone who was. There's a little bit of a double entendre here in that Huss means goose in his original language. And so there's actually some humor here. Again, as he's being burned at the stake, to say, "Today you all bake a goose, but there comes a swan after me." That's really an amazing thing of how Huss saw this Reformation that was about to happen. And then the last event here is Johann Gutenberg in 1456 invents the printing press. Think about why that's so important, to be able to mass produce the Bible. He produced the first Bible on the printing press. And that means that becomes, the printing press in itself becomes this way to spread ideas quickly and very far, catalyzes changes in politics and in theology. So not only is the Bible being translated into various languages, but it's also being mass produced for the first time to get it actually in the hands of people. And it's not hard to see how that would lead to the Reformation that would come later. So, a few main themes here as we look at the medieval church. These are the three questions that we explored. What would happen as we enter into this time? I think a couple themes that, there's the gap there showing the Dark Ages, how the gap where things were happening, but not anything that would rise to this level of 30,000 foot view. What are the main themes coming out of this section? Man, there's a lot of history here. There's so much that you go back and read and explore. I mean, Anselm and Aquinas, and just so much for you to dig into. And I would encourage you to do that. I think a big theme is the translation and transmission of the Bible. The Bible not just being sort of locked behind the glass doors of the Catholic Church, but actually being put in the hands of people for the first time, in their language, so that they can actually read it for the first time. Read it for themselves, read it in its fullness. You can sort of see how that would lead to this explosion of people wanting to get back to what the Bible actually teaches, if the church had gone off a little bit and was not teaching the Bible as clearly as it should have. Another theme we see here is martyrdom. We just talked about John Huss, who was martyred for his heretical beliefs. He wasn't a biblical heretic, but according to the church, he was. And so we see here people being persecuted because of their beliefs. You'll find all sorts of examples of heretics, whether they were actually heretics or not, being killed for their belief. And that was a big thing that was going on in this time and in the time of the Reformation. And then the final theme is Augustine. He just looms so large over this entire timeline, but in particular in the medieval church. There were no thinkers that could rise to his level, and really everyone was just trying to deal with what Augustine had said, to digest it and figure out, okay, what does that mean for my life? That's what theology was for the most part in the Middle Ages, was reckoning with the work that Augustine had done. So that's why he's such a big theme there. Again, I feel like we've left so much on the floor. We have. I hope that gives you some handlebars. We're 1,000 years in here, for the 1,400 years in the history of the church. The next video, we're going to look at the Reformation, where things really start cooking, and the history of the church really takes a turn when Martin Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and all those guys come on the scene. So hope you'll join us then. Looking forward to that. Thanks.